the ways in which you can essentially, accelerate the training process as well as take those neural networks and put them in production, right? And again, the last topic is generally, okay, my voice is low. Let me just reset my headset. Okay, is this better now? Is it much louder?
Yes,
Okay,
it's
thank you.
like that.
So basically, the last particular section, which is accelerating deep learning for inference, right? That means how do you essentially take these deep neural networks and put them in production, right? And this topic is, always, people tend to not put a lot of emphasis on this topic. And the reason why I want to bring it up is because, when essentially students become, maybe say machine learning engineer or data scientists, one of the key challenges that they need to keep in mind is, they are not training these deep neural networks just for, just for getting higher metrics on some training data set, right? Or the validation data set, right? But what they want to essentially do is take them to production and serve a specific purpose. And obviously, when you take these deep neural networks to production, it in itself brings a lot of challenges in terms of the compute time, as well as that how do you actually manage all of these neural networks and optimize them for deployment, right? So we are going to look at all those things right from the very scratch till the very end. And I hope, at least in today's session, I'll be able to paint a proper picture right from the GPU architecture side, understanding, how do you choose the right GPU, and what are the design choices underlying those GPUs for accelerating the training process, as well as for inferencing, and also have an holistic approach on the software side. So with that, let me just quickly give a very quick glimpse of the software stack that we'll be talking today. So I essentially, I understand there are a lot of different components that you see here, right? But if you actually look at, what work NVIDIA is doing in this space to bring, deep neural networks to production and for people to start building applications on top of our computing and the software stack, is we have tried to build an entire ecosystem, right from, improving the underlying hardware to making a software stack which is easy to use, which can be general purpose to say PyTorch and TensorFlow. And also we have also built these, domain specific application stack that tend to solve, very specific domain level problem statements, right? So today we are not going to cover the industry application framework. Yesterday we did cover Rapids. But there are also others for conversational AI, autonomous vehicles, video analytics, as well as for healthcare, and even a recommendation system. So what I'm going to essentially cover is the bottommost part, which is more broader, can be extended to frameworks like PyTorch and TensorFlow. And you as a user, if you have GPUs, how can you essentially leverage these system software stack for not just accelerating the training, but also understanding the deployment workflow as well. So with that, let me just quickly, just brush up the things that we talked yesterday, right? So till yesterday, we were putting a lot of emphasis on data analytics and machine learning. Um, okay, I think there is something on the chat with respect to the delay. Just give me a second. Okay, sorry. Yeah. So what we talked yesterday was basically two of the subsections, which was data analytics and machine learning. And today's focus is going to be more on the deep learning side. And generally, people tend to, confuse this and tend to, use the term artificial intelligence with deep learning very interchangeably. But rather, how I would like to understand, right, at least from a computer science perspective, is the fact that it is a subset again of AI and even machine learning itself, right? And the reason why, we refer this to artificial intelligence is because we are able to draw insights outside from these unstructured data, which in general doing with just a simple hard coded program is very difficult, right? And but if you actually see, right, at the end of the day, deep learning is, if you look at it from a mathematical compute perspective, you'll notice that it's basically just a huge or large chains of models with matrix multiplication and accumulation operations, right? So we are essentially going to see that how deep learning plays a very important role for dense and unstructured data, right? So with this, again, first question that we need to ask, right? Because see, we are not using machine learning just because it's a trending field, right? It is trending because people are trying to solve business specific use cases, which will bring value back to the businesses, and hence, rather than solving it manually by writing really large scale software programs manually by users, how about we take the power of data, which again is getting generated abundantly, and make use of these mathematical function approximators, or rather deep neural networks, to rather approximate that function rather than writing that logic, which again might be a pretty complex problem, np hard problem statement to solve. So with that, let's first try to understand what can be the different use cases and how that can be related to the business questions, because this is a very crucial task that people need to ask these questions when you are trying to bring business value using machine learning. You should know what business question are you trying to solve, and what can be the corresponding deep learning task to that particular business question, right? So starting from things like when you have these input modalities of text, images, videos, and audios, right? What are the various different business questions that you can ask, right? The first question is that is a certain thing present in that particular input, right? And again, the best example for this is images, right? When we do something like object detection, what we are essentially trying to find out is a bounding box as to where a specific object is present, and then also classifying to what class that particular bounding box object basically belongs to, right? So that is that can be generalized as a detection task. And if you look at different industries, people can use detection as a problem statement in different verticals with different names, right? So in healthcare, say, people can call it some kind of anomaly detection, be it in terms of cancer, or be it in terms of any other tumor or any other disease as well, right? In retail, it has a whole different meaning like targeted ads, right? That means, can you out of these various large bunches of ads that are particularly possible, what kind of ads are particularly present in this particular retail shop, right? The third kind of question for finance could be something more related to anomaly, right? Or rather cyber security, right? That means, are we able to find out if there is some security issue, or probably an anomaly behavior inside the cyber security logs itself, right? And again, that modality can be more related to the text data rather than the images. Similarly, you can also go ahead and extend this understanding to classification, segmentation, prediction, and even a recommendation, right? So these are some of the deep learning tasks, and some of the business questions that if somebody would like to ask, can basically relate to these deep learning problem statements with the appropriate business questions. Now, just to reiterate on what Professor Pavitra mentioned, that how basically the traditional machine learning is a bit different than the than using deep neural networks, right? And the first and the classy difference is the fact that for a very simple task like the detection and classification over here, if we had to do it with algorithms like SVM, which are traditional machine learning algorithms, what we'll first have to do is we'll have to handcraft certain image filters, right? So what you see here basically is one of such filter or image processing kernel. And what the user does is that he needs to define these different handcrafted kernels, or rather I would like to call it image processing convolution or kernels, which again will act as your features. And then you basically take multiple sets of such outputs of these images, which were basically applied by the image processing kernel on top of this, right? And then you basically apply the SVM for doing classification, right? Or even detection in that case. So right, and then you basically get the result. So what in traditional ways, what we are essentially doing is we are doing the feature extraction as well as the classification and the detection in two different pipelines. But if you actually look at the deep neural networks, what neural networks are really good at, as Professor Pavitra mentioned, is to approximate a really complex function, right? And that's where neural network can act as a very good feature extractor, as well as it can help you to. Um, is it just few people, or is my voice really not audible? Hello, could somebody confirm, is my voice audible? Okay, great. So I think it's pretty. I mean, it's for specific people. Okay, thank you. So as you can see here, right, neural networks are basically really good feature extractors, and what it does is it does both the task, the feature extraction as well as the classification and detection in one single stage, right? So when I say one single stage, what I'm basically just mean is that the neural network is able to, do the extraction as well as do the classification and detection all by itself, right? So you don't need to, handcraft any of those features by hand by writing those kernels on your own, the convolution image processing kernels. And don't worry, I'll basically, give a hands-on approach on this, right? We'll essentially try to understand what kind of filter kernels are being learned by these neural networks, and we'll try to, try to do all of those things during the hands-on. So just keep this concept in mind, and let's move forward, and then during practicals I'm sure it will get much clearer, right? And again, the motivation is that, in today's world we have a lot of these large scale data sets for uh, not just for images, right? Not just for image classification, but also for detection, segmentation, and other tasks like, image captioning as well, right? So, and again, this is ImageNet is one of the most widely used data sets, because most of the time, what people generally tend to do is the fact that because they might have small number of data sets for their particular problem statement, people generally, and again, this is a widely used common practice, is to take the weights of a pre-trained model on a large scale data set like ImageNet, and then further apply transfer learning and apply that on top of your data set, which might be smaller in the overall size, right? And again, this performs pretty well, right? Transferring the knowledge from one large scale data set to a downstream smaller data set is a very widely used paradigm in today's industry, right? And again, just to put a little more emphasis that how CNNs, which again are one of the building blocks for computer vision, have achieved much better performance on the ImageNet dataset over the past couple of years compared to the traditional approach of doing the feature engineering on your own, right? And GPUs have played a very important role in this, because as you already are pretty familiar with that, these are really compute intensive mathematical models, right? Hence you need some kind of the right architecture or the hardware architecture that can essentially take advantage of parallelizing these fused multiplication and addition operations across multiple cores, so that you can train these networks much faster. Right. So I quickly talked about computer vision, right? But again, another big booming field is NLP and natural language understanding, right? And what we see today is, NLP has gained a lot of traction because of the kind of large scale models and the kind of performance that you're getting from these models, right? So here, what I've tried to just show is what are the different NLP, NLU, and speech-related tasks that can be solved using deep learning and reaching almost human level accuracies, right? So for natural language understanding, you have things like question answering, sentiment analysis, summarization, relation extraction, semantic parsing, and for NLP, there are tasks like name entity recognition, text categorization, machine translation, so on and so forth. And for speech, you have speech recognition, which is basically converting speech to the corresponding text. And then you have the other method, which is just the opposite, that is taking the text and generating human like text or voice, or which is also called as text to speech, right? So again, all of these different NLP, NLU, and speech tasks also use really deep neural networks, right? And again, maybe some in the upcoming NSM sessions, we'll probably do a much deeper dive into NLP and NLU. But for today, we are going to put a lot of focus on computer vision only. And to back the point here, as you can see, Glue is one of the benchmark set up for NLP tasks, right? And the full form of glue is basically general language understanding and evaluation. That means how do you evaluate how these models are essentially performing on top of these data sets, right? So there are different tasks, and if you actually look at the leaderboard, you'll notice that there are a lot of different models like Albert, Alibaba DAMO architecture, Roberta, and ExcelNet, so on and so forth, which are again getting really high score for a lot of different glue tasks, right? And if you actually look at the base architecture behind even Albert, or probably even Roberta, it's basically a transformer based architecture, right? Which we also call it as transformers for BERT. So BERT also uses these transformer layers, which again are just large stacks of multi-head attention and fully connected layers, right? And these are just different variants. Roberta and Albert are just different variants of that, right? But if you actually see, right, and these are for the glue tasks. Let me now move to how. I mean, the point that I'm just trying to bring your out by these slides is the fact that data sets are getting larger, right? Believe it or not just in academia, but extensively in production companies. And this is not just across computer vision, but it is across computer vision and natural language processing and NLU as well, right? And also for a couple of reinforcement learning tasks, right? And you can actually see the kind of large scale models or data sets which are sorry, not models, but rather data sets which are being mentioned over here, right? And you see that there are two headings given, right? Unlabeled data and labeled data, right? And generally we see that whenever we are training our model with labeled data, most of the time, rather than most of the time, I would rather say that we tend to use supervised learning as the fundamental approach for training them. That means we have the class labels, right? We have the input and we also have the class labels which are annotated, right? uh, but another important task to also consider is what do you actually do with the unlabeled data? Because if you see, labeling is a very costly affair, right? It requires a lot of manual intervention. You require a lot of manpower to even annotate the data, right? So let me give a very quick example, right? If I have to do machine translation or train a model for machine translation, right? And if I have these large corpora of data, right, I would actually have to get people to sit and essentially convert or translate that word by word, right? Just think of it, how painful of a task it can be, right? Right. And so the point that I'm trying to bring here is how do we leverage this unlabeled data, right, for training our deep neural networks, right? Because majority in the industry, you'll notice that a lot of people don't have really large scale and high quality labeled data, right? And that's where the problem comes in, wherein that you need to work with unlabeled data and still try to achieve really good performance. Now the question comes, right, if I can't use supervised learning, what else am I left out with, right? And the answer to that particular question is, in today, we are seeing that self-supervised learning is becoming extremely important in the natural language processing domain. And when I say self-supervised learning, what that essentially means is you have a large unlabeled data corpora, right? You don't have the labels, but what you are doing is you are basically applying some function that is basically creating those dummy y ground truth values from the input x, and now you have both your x and your y's available to you. But the y's that you have gotten are not being labeled, but they are rather being are being created by using really smart pre-processing functions. So let me give you an example, right? And again, this is a very common example, and you'll see this at all the places, which is called language modeling. And if you actually look at language modeling, what it essentially does is you take a large scale corpora of text and you basically try to create these sequence labels, and basically what the task is about predicting the next word. And it is pretty easy to do, because say if you have a sequence of text, what you essentially do is you feed the say the first four words as the input, and the output essentially is basically going to be the next sequence of word, which might have some spacing of say one word after another, right? That is a very simple way of basically doing self-supervised learning via language models, right? That means you're trying to predict the next particular word, right, out of the text corpora. Now, once this entire again, if you look at it, it's both, right? You are using supervised learning, but the way you're creating these y ground truths is not by applying, rather applying some smart Y labels for you directly from the X data that you have, right? From the X data that you have, yes. And today, that is also being done extensively with GANs as well, right? Which basically stands for generative adversarial networks, where you have a lot of different pairs of unlabeled data, right? And again, if you see, the most of the compute time that we are spending today is on doing these self supervised learning tasks like language models and image pre-training. One more example that I want to give for images is, say for example, you have the entire ImageNet data, but you don't have the corresponding y labels with you, right? That means you only have the images, you don't have the labels of those images, right? So what you can essentially do is now you can basically convert these colored images into black and white images, and then basically formulate this as a colorization problem statement wherein you feed the black and white image, and the output image that you basically want to get is now a color image, right? So you basically do the entire training on top of this, and then say if you have few labels for say if you want to do 5 class classification, what you can now do is you can basically change the last layer, right? Rather than regenerating that input again, what you do is you remove all the last layers, and now you put these multi-layer perceptrons for the n number of classes that you have, and then you again retrain it with some of the samples that you have, and again can be 50, can be 100, can be even less than that, right? That will still provide you much better accuracies than training it from scratch or by random initialization, right? So these are the different tasks. The data sets are getting larger, right? And we need to be very smart of how we can basically still achieve better accuracy by leveraging things like self-supervised learning. And with that point, let me show you that today, most of the compute time that you're seeing that is getting spent, right, or the compute resources, at least in the NLP space, is for doing these pre-training tasks, right? That means you're now, if you look at the graph on the right, what you see is we have tried to plot the model size versus the train compute exaflop days, right? And what you see here is with architectures like GPT-3, which has 175 billion parameters, it essentially takes such a large compute infrastructure to train a model like GPT-3. And again, the amount of data set that you're also feeding it is in terms of a couple of hundred GPs, right? So there's a huge need of compute requirement if you're essentially doing these pre-training tasks for the task that you have at hand, right? But for specific cases where you're just trying to do transfer learning, right, you do need compute resources, but it might not be as large as training really large scale models, uh, uh, right, because you're not starting from scratch, but rather you're taking those pre-trained weights from a large data set on which it was already trained, right? So the net point that I want to bring here is that models are getting bigger, the data sets are also getting bigger, and the compute requirement is also growing with each passing day, right? So, and again, this is not just a problem, right? This is not just a problem of training, but it is also a problem of inferencing, right? And the reason why I say this is because every day, we use these lot of different services across YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, and all of them are using some kind of machine learning at the very back end, right? That means you need to make sure that your infrastructure that you have is also able to cater to the underlying requests that are coming in for the deployment as well. So there is a huge need of compute capability for training these deep neural networks on large scale data sets, but there is also a huge requirement in terms of inferencing, right? That means I need to get the least latency, but I should also get good amount of throughput as well, right? Because if you don't get the desired output of the models within a particular amount of time, the use case might lose its the importance that it has. And the best example for those are autonomous driving, right? Where if you don't do the inferencing and get the results within a couple of milliseconds, the entire system can go for a toss, right? Or the second example could be if you're using something like Siri or a Google Assistant. If it starts replying after 40-50 seconds, obviously you as a user will not be very comfortable in using it, or you won't find it useful at all, right? So there is a need for inference, there is also a need of compute for training as well, right? So again, this is a quick flow of how deep neural networks are essentially being trained. And again, Professor Pavitra had described this in extreme details, but I just had this slide just so that I just do a very quick recap, right? So you have these different images with different classes, and then you have these deep neural networks. And again, the image that you see here, right, can be also be extrapolated to multi-layer perceptron, can also be extrapolated to CNNs or even transformers for that matter of fact, right? Right. So just think of these black no, circles as some kind of a black box for now, right? Let's not get into the architecture. We'll talk about that later on. But just think of this as a black box, right? So essentially, you're sending these images inside this particular black box, and you are getting some class probabilities based on the n number of classes that you have. And then because you have the ground truth, you can essentially use the loss function to find the error. And then what you do is you essentially do the back propagation algorithm, wherein you're essentially trying to calculate the error with respect to each of these particular layers, right from the last layer to the very first layer, right? Now if I had to again comment on this from a computational perspective, what I see is you are trying to do a lot of matrix multiplication and accumulation operation in the forward pass, but also you are doing the same even during the backward pass, right? So there's a lot of mat mulls that goes in during the forward computation, and there are a lot of mat mulls that go in also during the backward computation. Now remember, people generally tend to confuse back propagation with optimization, right? And the main difference between both of them is back propagation is an algorithm to basically calculate the error or rather the gradient, and optimization is basically taking
a step towards the global minima, right? That means you're essentially updating your weights, which is W new is equals to W old minus learning rate times the gradient of that particular layer that you had calculated during the backpropagation step, right? So again, if I had to look at the compute intensive part, backpropagation is going to be the most compute intensive pass of the entire training, right? Second would essentially come the forward propagation, and then probably would come the optimization and the loss calculation, right? In that particular order. And during inferencing, what you essentially do is you just remove this entire back propagation and optimization loop, right? And just continue by only feeding these images and getting the corresponding outputs, right? So that is a quick difference between both of them. uh, so with this, now let me move to another aspect, which is that what is how does a DL compute look from a 10,000K feet view, right? Again, I'm not going into the details, but just for you to understand and relate that to the GPUs. So if you look at convolution, fully connected layers, or even self-attention layers, right, that you generally see in the transformer architecture, right, you'll notice one thing, that all these operations can essentially be represented as a general purpose matrix multiply, right? Or rather, we would like to call it as gems, right? And there are different ways of doing this. There are different implementations. There is not just one single implementation that is efficient, but there are multiple different implementations like IM2 call, or rather the Vinograd for CNNs, right? So I won't get into all those details at this point, but the point that I'm trying to bring here is you can essentially formulate convolution, self-attention layers, as well as these fully connected layers as basically general purpose matrix multiplications, right? So and again, the good part is that GPUs are very friendly for matrix multiplication operations, right? Because you can essentially parallelize all those particular computation across all the SMs on top of these cores, right? That means each of these individual SM cores can now take a small patch of this matrix multiplication computation, and essentially do the entire forward and the backward pass on top of the GPUs by effectively exploiting the parallelism on top of these cores. And I'll get into more details of certain consideration that also needs to be taken into place while doing this, right? So we have these matmults, or rather the gem operations for WX plus B operation, which you see here, which is the input activation and the weights, right? You're essentially just doing WX plus B in the simplest format, and then you're essentially applying some kind of a non-linearity function, which is the activation math, right? Which is more of a pointwise function, right? So here you're not doing any matmults, but you are just applying one single function on top of all the elements, right? And then you keep continuing with this chain across multiple layers, right? So with that, again, the point that I just wanted to bring out was, if you even look at RNNs or LSTMs, you'll notice that even in LSTMs, you have these MLP layers, which has this additional component of reoccurrence, wherein you are essentially, feeding also the past input to the next, sorry, the output of the past input as the input to the next output, right? But that can still be formulated as a matrix multiplication operation, right? Because at the end of the day, you're still using an MLP layer only, which is a multi-layered perceptron, right? So essentially, all these different layers can be made parallel on top of the GPUs. Now, if I had to look at all these different operations, right, and I had to bucketize them into their appropriate, sections, what would they look like, right? Um, so there are essentially going to be four different functions, right? Or rather a group of functions that are going to be present in most of the neural networks, right? Starting with the matrix multiplications, right? Like linear layer, the convolution layer, or the self attention layer, or the batched matrix multiplication layer, right? all of those are basically matrix multiplications, right? And this is where most of the acceleration essentially comes from. And I'll talk about how GPUs have has these new processing cores apart from the CUDA cores called the tensor cores that help the GPUs to take the full advantage of applying these matmal operations, right? So we'll get into those details when we talk about the GPU architecture from that perspective. Now, apart from these matmals, you also have a lot of different other operations, right? So you have things like reduction operations like batch norm, layer norm, sum, softmax, right? And then you have these loss functions: cross entropy, L1 loss, L2 loss, weight decay, so on and so forth, right? And then you have these pointwise functions, right? Like I said previously, all the activation functions are basically pointwise function. So the point that I'm trying to bring here is the most of the juice that can be bought in terms of optimization essentially comes from these matrix multiplication operations, right? And we see about 8 to 16x acceleration in the overall performance using FP16 and bfloat 16 tensor cores. But don't worry about these terms. I'll try to demystify them in the upcoming slides. So I'm just going to pause here for a couple of seconds, look for some questions if there are any, and then move forward. So let me quickly just look at the um Q&A section and see how many questions are there. Okay, so there is a query saying only global minima or either global minima or maxima based on the optimization problem. Yes, the optimization problem can be the minima or maxima, but generally in deep neural networks, we are trying to minimize the particular loss, right? That means we are trying to bring down the value of the loss function or the objective function. There are different names that how people refer it to, and we basically in neural networks we majority of the time do the minima. In architectures like GAN, we also apply some kind of maximization technique as well, but I think that is out of the scope for today's presentation. Then there is a query saying that can you throw some light on ReLU? Okay, sure. So basically what if you actually look at uh, okay, sure. So basically, if you look at these pointwise functions, right? ReLU is a very simple function. That means if the input value that has come in, right, if it is greater than zero, right, output that as one, right? And if you look at sigmoid, what sigmoid will do is it will basically try to bring uh, the unnormalized log probabilities between 0 and 1, right? But if you actually look at ReLU, what ReLU will do is that it will just check if the input activation, or rather the input term that has come in, which is basically x, if it is greater than 0, keep the output as it is, right? And if you look at sigmoid, the whole goal of sigmoid is basically to clamp it between 0 and 1, right? So if you look at ReLU is the de facto and the most widely used activation function across a lot of the architectures that you'll see today. Obviously, there are different variants of ReLU like leaky ReLU, p-ReLU, and others that also gets used, but ReLU is something which is almost a de facto, right? Now, from a computational perspective, also it's more efficient because when you apply sigmoid or even tanh, you're essentially applying a lot of exponent function, right? You have some e to the power, some function on top of that, right? But if you actually look at ReLU, it's something like a switch function wherein if the value is greater than 0, please pass the value as it is, right? But if it is less than 0, clamp it to 0, right? So it's a very simple activation function that just clamps all the values less than 0. So I hope that throws some light on ReLU at least. Now, there is another thing that explain the technical terms in the operations. Great question. So I would rather say just hear these words now. right? We will get into those technical details when we implement, or when we basically look at the hands-on practical. So don't worry about it at this point. This slide is just meant to give you a perspective of where the computation juice comes from by using a GPU, and what are the various terminologies that are being addressed, right? So don't worry about it. We will talk about that in more details. There is another question. Are there any cases where CPU performance on training and testing performs better to GPU, or is it always GPU that gives the better performance? So great question. The way I would like to answer this is, if you have deep neural networks, which again are de facto architectures that people use, and when I say deep, what I essentially mean is layers more than probably two consecutive layers. If there are more than two consecutive layer, it is basically a deep neural network, right? But generally what we see is, if you just make a simple layer with just two or three layers or even four layers, performance might not be that better. Obviously it will still be better than the CPU performance any day. But if you actually look at deep neural, bigger the network is, the more parameters you can parallelize across the entire GPU, right? So more parameters, more parallelization, right? So it's directly basically proportional to each other. So I hope that at least provides just a quick view. But yes, the GPU will always outperform, but the magnitude of outperforming depends on how big the architecture is. So let me now come to this slide, right? And what the point that I'm trying to bring here is, when ImageNet challenge was taken up, and LXNet won that particular challenge, right? Since that point of time, we understood that neural networks are going to be, are going to be used extensively. And again, GPUs had to be, the GPU architecture, right? The hardware architecture in itself had to be optimized for doing those operations, right? It already were, but how can we essentially make it much better to get better performance, right? And that's where the whole idea of tensor cores came into the picture. And I'll talk about in more details about tensor cores, but currently just think of tensor cores as an hardware implementation along with the software implementation that essentially helps you to do fused matrix multiplication and accumulation operation more efficiently on top of these GPUs, right? So I'll talk in more details about how these tensor cores are, what is the design, and the performance numbers of these tensor cores, right? And then we basically introduced the tensor core design first in the V100 architecture, right? And then we kept improving that in the Turing and the Ampere architecture as well. So in the Ampere architecture, we have our third generation of tensor cores, and I'll give you more details about that in the upcoming slides, right? So again, let's try to summarize a couple of things and couple of key points from a compute perspective, right? First is for having really fast or efficient training of these deep neural architectures, you need to write CUDA functions for these gem operation or convolution operations in such a way that it provides you with maximum performance, right? So from a computational perspective, there needs to be a design consideration for general purpose matrix multiplication, convolution, and other variants, right? And also for the data type that we are using. Now, I'm sure you must be familiar with FP32, which stands for floating point 32, which is an IEEE compliant number, right? You must also be familiar with floating point 16, which is again IEEE compliant, similarly for in32 and others, right? But you'll notice there are two data types which are very odd and written over here, which is TF32 and BF16. Just a second, I'll drink some water. Right. So what you see here is TF32 and BF16, which are pretty odd data types because we have not heard it or we have not studied about them during our classes in engineering. right? And which is true because these are some of the data formats which were introduced in the Ampere architecture, and I'll go into more details about how these data types essentially looks like. From an architectural perspective, we'll look at Volta, Turing, and Ampere. And from an algorithmic perspective, we'll see if we can cover the tiled, parallel reductions, and implicit gems, right? And there are certain libraries like cuDNN, which is CUDA Accelerated Deep Neural Network Library, cuBLAS, which is for linear algebra subroutines, cuTensor for tensor acceleration, cuSparse for sparse matrix acceleration, and TensorRT for optimizing the neural network for doing inferencing, right? So we'll talk about TensorRT in more detail, but all of the other libraries are essentially can be used via these deep learning frameworks like PyTorch and TensorFlow, right? So let me first start with the V100 Tensor Core GPU, right? So this was the first GPU which had the Tensor Core design, and what it basically had was that now you have these new GPU optimized software implementation called uh, uh, tensor core operation, which will essentially help you to do these matrix multiplication efficiently, right? So that was the first time it was being introduced. Now, even apart from that, there were other improvements, but I'll put more emphasis on tensor cores because that is more related to the deep neural network architecture side, right? So just before we get there, let's just first understand some of the data types and what does those data types essentially mean from a compute perspective, right? So what you see here is floating point 16 and floating point 32, and I had also mentioned this yesterday, but I'm sure there are a couple of people who have joined in today. So think of these data types as a scale, right, or as a ruler, right? And the length of the scale is nothing but the range in the data type. That means how long the ruler is. Is it 5 centimeter? Is it 10 centimeter? Or is it a 30 centimeter scale or a ruler? Right? That is basically the range of it, right? That means how what is the extent to which these or the maximum numbers that can be basically can be represented inside that data type, right? And then comes the second part, which is the precision bit, right? And this has to do more with the part where so say for example in a scale you have two consecutive numbers, right? 1 and 2 as an example, right? How many markings do you have between these two numbers, right? Which is basically how many markings do you markings do you have between two integer numbers, right? So essentially precision, the bigger the precision, the more larger the dynamic range to cater to basically the numbers between the integer numbers, which are nothing but the decimal numbers, right? That means till which decimal point can I basically represent that number in my data type, right? So if you see in floating point 32, I have 8 bits of range and 23 bits of precision, right? And in FP16, I have 5 bit of range and 10 bits of precision, right? Now, why understanding this is extremely crucial is because of the fact that it has direct link with the tensor cores, right? Because whenever we look at any GPU architecture, right, the performance is always compared based on what is the performance on that particular data type, right? So essentially if you see the SM, right, and again I had showed this also yesterday, but I'll put more emphasis today. And here you'll see that there are multiple different cores, right? From the FP64 cores to int cores to FP32 cores. And then you'll see these large blocks over here, which are written as tensor cores, right? And essentially what these are basically specialized hardware execution units that are not just meant to do efficient matrix multiplication and accumulation, but these essentially don't work on atomic numbers, but they rather work on 4 cross 4 cross 4 tile of the matrix, right? That means now rather than the user doing individual matrix multiply on individual cores, how about I take that small piece of the matrix and essentially use these tensor cores to accelerate that particular path of the matrix multiply, right? So it essentially helps you to do more operations, more number of operations per instruction cycle, and essentially gives you a much better throughput, right? But there is a certain caveat. The caveat here is that these tensor cores can only be activated when you do operations in FP16. That means your input is in FP16, your matrix or the weight matrix is also in FP16, and when you're accumulating these results, right, that only happens in FP32, right? That means you're doing an FP16 FMA operation, fuse multiplication operation, and then you're accumulating the results in an FP32 register, right? So the computation happens in FP16 only, but the accumulation happens in FP32. So it's a pretty important point to remember here. And this chain keeps on continuing. That means you do the operation in FP16, accumulate the result in FP32, cast it back to FP16, right, which is the output, which will act as the input to the next layer. And again, you'll again do the FP16 to FP16, compute between the input activation and the weight matrix, and you'll continue it across all the chain of elements, right? So these cores are very efficient for essentially doing this fuse multiplication accumulation operation in FP16, right? So I hope that provides an very high level overview of what it does. Let me talk a bit about the performance numbers. So as you can see here, for FP16, right, compared to FP32, you almost see 8x improvement in performance. Now again, when I say 8x improvement, this is very much dependent on the architecture and also on the framework, the way it is being implemented, right? So 8x is the theoretical peak. You might not always get a 8x improvement in performance, but yes, you will get about 2x or 3x or even 4x at times improvement in the overall performance using the FP16 compute math, right? uh, so with that, let me move now my gear to FP, sorry, not FP, but rather the Ampere architecture, right? So we talked about FP16, we talked about FP32, and we talked about the Ampere architecture, right? But we did not talk about, sorry, we talked about the Volta architecture, but we did not talk about the Ampere architecture. So this is the latest generation that we currently have. And if you see, what we have done is we have improved the tensor core operation uh, from the Volta architecture, so that it also supports a new data type called the TF32, which is the tensor float 32 operation, right? That's why you see in the additional data type point, there has been a mention of p float 16 and tensor float 32. And there is an more interesting thing that we'll see, which is the sparsity accelerator. So what we have done in the Ampere architecture is we have tried to improve the tensor core, and also added more additional features like the sparsity accelerator. So let's get into more details about what this essentially means, right? So in the A100 design, you'll notice that there are two components. One is the scaling part, and the second is the specialization part. So the specialization part comes in when you want to train these deep neural networks, right? That means you want to essentially efficiently train these deep neural networks using the tensor core operation, as well as exploit the sparsity inside these architectures, right? And I'll talk about sparsity in more detail, but on a high level, what this means is in your weight matrix. If you look at these weight matrix, a lot of these components might have values, or the weight values somewhere near to zero, right? And when you multiply that with the activation, the corresponding output that you get is also somewhere near zero, right? Or the number is very small. So that essentially does not attribute, or does not contribute much to the final layer of prediction, right? So those wasted cycles of computation can essentially be skipped using this sparsity accelerator, right? uh, but I'll get into those details when we talk about the sparsity in specific. On the left side, what you see is the scaling part. That means how do I basically scale the GPU for doing more multi GPU training, right? And that's why we have these high speed interconnect called the NVLink. And again, we have introduced the third generation of the NVLink, which gives you it gives you 600 gigabytes of bidirectional communication from the GPUs that you have, right? That means now, when you want to do distributed training, or say even model parallelism, right, where you have distributed the model parameters across multiple GPUs, right, the synchronization between the weight values across these different GPUs also needs to happen at a very high speed, right? And that's where the scatter and gather operation comes into the picture. Hence, you need a very efficient interconnect, and that's where the NVLink plays a very important role for one GPU to essentially communicate with the other GPU, right? Or to access some of the memory parameters of that particular model in the other GPU, right? Uh, so with that, let me move to the A100 part, right? And again, I've talked about these performance numbers, and again, these are the theoretical peak numbers. But let's try to understand these numbers in detail, right? So yesterday we talked about the CUDA core peak flops, right? But if you actually see the difference between the FP32 peak flop versus the TF32 peak flop, you'll notice that there's a huge difference, right? And just give me a couple of seconds, but we'll talk about TF32 in more detail. But think of TF32 as a data type which is very similar to FP32, but the only difference is, I mean, the ranges are the same, but the only difference is in the precision. That means in your FP32 you had 23 bits of the precision range, but in TF32 you might have a smaller precision scale over there, right? And I'll get into those details soon. So here, if you look at the instruction per cycle, you'll notice that for the tensor cores and for TF32, I can do 512 instruction per cycle, right? And that's where you'll notice that the peak performance numbers, right, gets calculated by the clock frequency of the GPU, which is 1.41 gigahertz, multiplied by 108 SMs, right, multiplied by the 512, which is the instruction per cycle, and multiplied by 2, right? And that essentially gives me the peak teraflop number. This is not actually G flop, this is essentially meant to be T flop, sorry. So that essentially gives me the total number of T flop of, sorry, this is G flop, sorry, yeah. So it's going to be 156 teraflops, right? And if I add the sparsity accelerator, right, the sparsity accelerator, what the sparsity accelerator will do is it will again give you 2x improvement in performance as well, right? Because you're essentially trying to skip those zero values which were present in the matrix itself. So here, let's look at the TF32 data format and the FP32, and what is the difference, and what is the difference between float 16 and floating point 16. So here you'll notice that the FP32 and TF32, the range is same. That means both of them have 8 bits, right? But if you actually look at the precision scale, it has reduced from 23 bits to 10 bits, right? And what we understood was the fact that even if you do the computation from FP30 to TF32, you'll still get very similar performance, sorry, not performance, but rather metrics with respect to the accuracy, right? But you get much better performance, overall performance, right? So what we have done is we have tried to build the third generation of these tensor cores, which now has support for the TensorFloat 32 as a data format. So you as a user don't have to change your code anymore. The cuBLAS library in itself will do all the hard work of exporting the FP32 data format to TF32 internally itself, right? The second data format that we see here is BrainFloat 16. So what has been done is we have kept the range as same 8, right? That means 8 bits of range. But now again, the precision has reduced from 10 to 7, right? And again, this is also one data type which is also used in the tensor TPUs, which are the tensor processing units. So if you even look at TPUs, you'll notice that there is an option of casting your data type to BrainFloat 16, right? So in all of these different data types, BrainFloat and TensorFloat are not the IEEE compliant data types, but they are being now used for training deep neural networks, across different accelerators. And what you see here, the mid diagram, is the fact that you basically do the operation in TF32 format, but you still do the accumulation in FP32, right? And in Volta, you must have remembered that instead of TensorFloat 32, we were doing it with floating point 16, right? So this gives you almost 4x improvement on a lot of linear solvers as well for HPC application. Let me give you few numbers pretty soon as to how TF32 can improve the overall performance as well for training these deep neural networks. Now, the second part is the sparsity accelerator. So what we see is, in a lot of these transformer architectures today, we see that a lot of these matrix have a lot of zero values or numbers which are very close to zero, right? And what our the research team understood was the fact that it doesn't make sense to waste a lot of cycles on those computation, because those are basically waste of computational cycles. So is there a way of fine tuning these weights somehow, right, wherein I only take the non-zero data and the non-zero indices, and then essentially perform the gem operation, right? So what this helps you to do is that it helps you to prune out, I mean, you're not actually doing model pruning, but rather you're trying to identify those parametric values which are not contributing to the weights, and are the values are almost near to zero, right? And you're trying to skip those calculations and are only taking the non-zero data and doing the gem operations on top, right? And so if you look at it, there is approximately no loss in the inferencing accuracy as well, but it gives you about 2x reduction in the weight footprint in terms of the forward and the backward computation, as well as in saving the bandwidth as well, right? And that's why you see that there is a 2x improvement in the overall tensor core throughput using the structured sparsity. So till now, we have talked about floating point 16. We have talked about the integer. Sorry, we have not talked about integer 8 yet. We have talked about FP32, TF32, right, and FP16 and BFloat 16, right? So another important aspect is the fact that for integers, right, what we see is today inferencing generally happens on FP16, right? But you can also use integer 8 for doing inferencing as well. Obviously, it comes with its own caveats, but you can do some kind of precision calibration. When you move from doing the inferencing on FP16 to integer 8, right? And it obviously requires some additional data, and based on that additional data, it is basically going to calculate a calibration cascade which will be used for doing all the upscaling and downscaling for integer 8 as well. So integer 8 can be used for inferencing, and for training you'll either use TF32, FP16, FP32, or even BrainFloat 16 for that matter. One more important point to notice is the architectural difference between the Volta and the Ampere core. you'll notice that the Volta cores have two tensor cores, right? But much sleeker tensor cores. But if you actually look at the Ampere architecture, you'll see that there is only one large tensor core which is there, right? And this is because we have built in the support for TensorFlow 32, which again is a bigger data type range than FP16. Hence, you see that the tensor core structure is also much bigger in that case. So this is the main difference in the tensor core. Instead of two, now you have one huge tensor core which can accumulate, which can basically accommodate a much bigger matrix, as well as can accommodate a bigger data type like TensorFlow 32. And there are also some additional tensor core capability for floating point 64 in Ampere, as well as for TF32 for FP32. But in case of the Volta architecture, we did not have tensor cores for floating point 64 at all, right? So the tensor core of the Ampere architecture is more general purpose, can be used for floating point 64 as well as for TensorFlow 32, and also for floating point 16 slash BrainFloat 16, compared to the Volta architecture that was there. Let me give some performance numbers. So as you can see here, the Ampere architecture with the TensorFloat 32 gives you 6x improvement in performance for the transformer architecture like BERT, transformer, and XL large. For recurrent networks also, it gives about 4 to 3.3x improvement for Tachytron 2 and for GNMT. And for convolution, you see about 2x to 2.25x improvement in the performance, right? The convolution, okay, so there is a question. Let me take the question. Can the tensor cores be used for double floating point? That's correct. It can be used for floating point 64 as well. Yes. These are some of the numbers. Uh, does reducing the just a second. Does reducing the precision affect the accuracy? Great question. So just to justify that, when we go from floating point 32 to TF32, you'll notice that the top one accuracy is still almost similar, right? That means, so we have done the benchmarking across different architectures, right from the classification architectures to detection, segmentation, as well as the language architectures. And you'll notice that the performance numbers or the convergence for TensorFlow 32 is almost very similar to that of floating point 32, right? So even though, yes, you are reducing the precision, but even after reducing the precision, you are not seeing much degradation in the overall top one accuracies, right? And this is across all the three different tasks which are mentioned over here, right from classification to detection to even language modeling. So that's why it's kind of safe to assume that you can use TensorFlow 32 without hampering your accuracy or the metrics by a very huge margin. So there are some questions, and the tensor cores shall be more bigger for double floating point. That is absolutely correct. Yes, the tensor cores are much bigger in that case. That's why you see that instead of two, uh, so instead of two, you have basically are seeing one large tensor core over here in the Ampere architecture. Um, what are TensorFlow servables? I'm not really sure what that question basically means. If you would like to maybe reiterate on that question. So there's another question saying that, so you have compromised with little bit of accuracy. So yes, there is a bit of degradation for some of the architectures, but it is not, I mean, it's almost negligible, right? It's probably in 0.10 or 0.15 different between the FP32 and TF32. There is another question, why the orientation of the architectures are different. I'm not exactly again sure what do we mean by orientation? If you would want to maybe expand on that particular statement a bit, I'll be able to provide a little more better perspective. There was another question: how is the performance of FPGAs compared to GPU for deep learning application? Again, a great question. So FPGAs are also great, but I don't have any performance comparison between GPUs and FPGA. But I would like to point out a very specific difference between the GPUs and the FPGA. Right? FPGA are meant for doing very specific functionality, right? But if you look at GPUs, these are more general purpose. So if you look at FPGA, you'll notice that they would be very good at only doing these gem operations, but might not be good at doing other parallel operations, right? But if you actually look at GPUs, you'll notice that they are not just good at doing these fused multiplication accumulation operation, but it is also very good at doing general purpose parallel computing, which might not require to do the FMA operation for that matter of fact. So I don't have any number, but I would say that GPUs are more general purpose compared to FPGA, and I mean, at least in the MLPerf results, right, which is the ML performance, which is a state of the art benchmark that people do every year. Our results have are the best across all the different chips that are currently available, which are commercially available. Again, can be FPGA, can be others as well. How much precision is okay for image classification methods? Uh, again, I'm not really sure how to exactly answer that particular question. It would again depend on the problem statement, but I would rather say that for image classification, your precision and the accuracy metrics should be at least about 90% if you want to take it to production. Actually, 90% is pretty common. Rather, you should always be gunning for 95 plus, at least in the production environments. Okay, so there is an example that is for something like cancer detection. So again, because cancer detection is a very a mission critical task. That means if even if you have false positives, right, you might come into a lot of trouble, right? So you want to make sure that you try to capture the I mean, the accuracy metric does not have to be highest for such tasks, because you might have few number of samples for the abnormality compared to the class where you have the healthy class, right? So if I simply just want to do a classification for an healthy image versus an non-healthy image, right, the number of samples that I would have for the non-healthy image would be much less compared to the healthy images. So that is why it becomes important that you have really good precision for such tasks, rather than just relying on the accuracy metrics. So okay, so there was another question saying that the FP32 is on the left because of tensor core, but on Volta it's at the left corner. Oh, sorry, yeah, I think I've the Ampere architecture is on the left, and the Volta architecture is on the right, but on the top I think I've mentioned it wrongly. Okay, so with that, one more point that I want to just talk about before we leave for the break and start the hands-on, is the fact that when you do multi GPU training, it becomes very important for you to understand a couple of aspects, right? And the aspects are that you need to have really high performant inter GPU communication. For that, we have the NVLink to provide the maximum network bandwidth across two GPUs. And what you see that your CPUs will be also connected with the GPUs, and the GPUs will also be interconnected with the other GPUs. And when you do the entire cycle, the data loading happens over the PCI bus, uh, which is an interconnect that we talked about yesterday as well, right? So the data loading happens on over the PCI switch. But when you look at the gradient averaging, because this is something that is going to happen more frequently, when you have basically done the forward and the backward computation across all the GPUs, and when you want to synchronize these gradients, you need to make sure that you have a library that can do efficient scatter and gather operation as well on top of the NVLink. And that's where the NVLink plus the Nickel library, which is NVIDIA's communication library, comes into the picture, that helps you to do these things more efficiently. So in short, data loading happens over the PCI, the gradient averaging happens over the NVLink, and basically there is no congestion between the PCI where the data is coming from, and second, which is the gradient synchronization across these GPUs. So these are some of the hardware considerations and understanding that I think are important, that serves as the fundamental building block for doing large scale training as well, and rather I would reframe that as efficiently training these models on large scale. So that was all. Okay, so there's another question. Can NVLink work over two GPUs in two different boxes? The answer to that is no. When you have two different, so when you say two different boxes, you mean two different servers. So NVLink is an inter GPU, sorry, rather an basically is is used for connecting GPUs within the system. But when you want to connect the GPUs from one system to the other system, you would have to go via the NIC route, right, which is basically a network adapter card. And in that case, for high performance computing, people generally tend to use the Mellanox ConnectX 6 cards, which basically provides you with a bandwidth of about 100 to 200 gigabytes per second inter node communication, not the intra node communication. So think of NVLink as intranode, that is within the node, high speed interconnect between the GPUs, and the NIC cards, like the Mellanox cards, can be used for basically doing the internode communication on about 100 and 200 gigabytes per second of network bandwidth. There is some network issue. Can you please? Okay, so what minimum environment should we have for the hands-on in the next session? So ideally, you should have the driver, NVIDIA driver installed, and you should also have you should have the Docker environment if that is available. If you don't have that, Anaconda will also work fine, right? But you should only have the PyTorch packages available with you to do these hands-on. So just make sure that any system with PyTorch is available. And in case if you want to exactly follow the way I do it, you should have Docker also installed so that we can leverage the NGC containers for our applications. There is another question. What about MPI cluster with GPU InfiniBand, etc.? So great question. So when you do distributed training for deep learning, using frameworks like Horoword, at the very base, you are going to use the MPI communication. And when we say that we are clustering these GPUs with InfiniBand, so InfiniBand are basically the cables, but the cable needs to be attached to some network adapter, right? And generally those are NICs, but in this case, if you are using the InfiniBand, you'll need the Mellanox. You should ideally use the Mellanox ConnectX series of network adapters with this band, with the InfiniBand, to get the maximum performance. So yes, for multi-node training, you will require MPI, which again gets used in frameworks like Horoword as well. So NVLink, again, I'll just reiterate, NVLink is for inter GPU communication within the node. ConnectX 6 is the network adapter card for best network performance. And then you have the InfiniBand cables that you connect to probably a Mellanox switch, and then connect it back to these the ConnectX series of uh, uh, the network adapters that you have. Yes, I think GTX 1650 Ti should be fine. I don't see much challenge. Yeah, I think it should be fine. But yes, I'm not sure if it has the tensor cores, so I'm not sure if we'll be able to see massive, differences using the tensor cores for the session. But yes, you can use it for doing the demonstration purpose.